Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the 32nd Annual Rock's Gap Heritage Day. If you haven't been over to the cafeteria and seen the posters, please take some time and go over there. If you're probably related to most everybody here. So as you look around at name tags, if you see any familiar names, introduce yourself. And I know we have some people from California and Montana and New Jersey and Maryland and some other states too, probably, that I'm just not familiar with. We've got some excellent programs today. The first one is Karl Rhodes. Karl and our family have other ties besides local history because our fathers were at VMRC together for several years and enjoyed each other's company up there, going on field trips and taking part in the VMRC programs. So we're grateful for that connection too. Karl, though, has researched extensively Peggy's War and published a book just recently. And I'll read description of Karl. He was born in Rockingham County, graduated from Turner Ashby, and then he's the great-great-grandson of Peggy Rhodes, whose photograph is here. He retired from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, where he was a senior managing editor of the research department. Previously, he was director of external communications for Media General and executive editor of Virginia Business Magazine. He and his wife, Kim, live in Richmond. And they have a table in the cafeteria where the book will be available for sale. And I'm sure he'd love to talk to you about the history. So I'm going to turn it over to Karl now. And thank you very much for coming, Karl.
Thank you, Pat. Pat forgot to mention that she is one of my role models here today. Pat has given me great advice on how to sell Peggy's War, because she has written several books and she knows how to sell them. I will say that Pat's advice is very good. So if you're looking for someone who offers good advice, I recommend Pat. The other role model here is Peggy Shiflett, who has written several books and will be doing a presentation later on this afternoon. And I think she's going to get a little mention in this one as well. Now, the other person I want you to focus on is my great-great-grandmother, Peggy Rhodes. This is not her, this is just a model pretending to be Peggy, but it is a model that is based as closely as possible on what her daughter looked like at that age. So her daughter, we do have a picture of her daughter when she was in her late 30s, although Peggy would have, for the most of this book, Peggy would have been late 20s, early 30s. So very, very young to be running a depot on the Underground Railroad for Mennonites and Dunkers, and eventually others as well, who refused to fight or were done fighting in the Civil War. So Peggy did this while her husband was dying of tuberculosis. Back then we would have called it consumption, but he was dying, and she was there to raise 5 small children during this time. She actually had some of those children while running the depot. And she was also trying to manage a 120-acre farm because her husband was not really able to do much farm work either. So she had a lot on her, and was a very remarkable woman. Now, for today's presentation, we actually won't talk quite as much about Peggy as we will about the refugees, or depending on your perspective, the refugees or the draft dodgers or deserters that she was assisting and protecting. So the war began, obviously, and in July we had a calling out of the militia. There were volunteers going off to war before that, but in July there was a general call in Virginia, and most of the men, Mennonites and Brethren, that were opposed to war were allowed to go into the militia, but really under protest. They would vow to their, usually their mothers, and also the bishop of the church, that they wouldn't kill anyone and they wouldn't hurt anyone when they went off to be in the war. And many of them went to Winchester, to the training camp at Winchester, and it didn't go very well. They didn't make very good soldiers. They did not, for the most part, shoot at the enemy, so they were really a liability on the battlefield. And Stonewall Jackson recognized this, and when it came time for the fall furloughs for these soldiers to come back to the valley to plant the crops for the winter seeding, they were allowed to do so. More so the Mennonites and the Brethren than everyone else, but most of the soldiers were allowed some time to work their farms. And at this point, the church, the Mennonite church, really changed its position on whether or not it was okay to go off to war, even if you do promise not to kill anyone. So the church basically said, we will not allow you to be in the church anymore if you do go back to the war. So people like Manassas Heatwole here, who is my great-great-grandfather, had a tough choice, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them decided that they would either hide or participate in the Underground Railroad. Of course, at this point, the Underground Railroad doesn't really exist, but it's being developed. And it's being developed as a cooperative effort between Mennonites and the German Baptist Brethren, which were commonly at that time called Dunkers. And we still use that term, so Dunkers. So this network is being put in place in that winter time frame. And here we have, these are actually Peggy's own words describing her depot on the Underground Railroad. So this gives us a pretty good idea of how it worked. And I like this because it's verbatim testimony that was in the Unionist and the Civil War experience in the Shenandoah Valley, which was done in part by Norman Wanger, Norman, where are you? There's Norman over here on my right, who did an amazing job of putting together testimony from Rockingham County, all the testimony before the Southern Claims Commission of mostly Mennonites and Dunkers, but other people as well who were trying to get reimbursed from the government for the property that was taken from them by the Union forces. So Peggy says, many times they came and stayed at our place 5 or 6 together at a time, and would stay sometimes several days waiting for the guides to take them through the mountains. We had a place under the house where we could conceal persons when necessary. And actually this place was under Peggy's bedroom floor in the first floor of the house. And so if you think about this woman who's doing all of this work, and then when it's time to go to sleep at night, quite often there's 5 or 6 men that she may or may not know sleeping underneath of her bedroom. And this is just to give you an idea of where Peggy actually lived. Mole Hill is in the background. How many of you have read the book already? Quite a few. So Mole Hill is an important part of the book, obviously. And Peggy was living in the shadow of Mole Hill. All of the green area that you see there would have been part of the Rhodes farm, and some additional acreage behind that in an area that is now called Belmont Estates. So we have the Underground Railroad in place now. The war has started, and it is March 10th, 1862. And this quote comes from Jedediah Hotchkiss, who made a lot of the maps that we see from the Civil War era of the Valley. He was an excellent map maker, and he was also an assistant to Stonewall Jackson. But on March 10th, none of that had happened yet, and Governor Letcher, Virginia governor, by proclamation called out the militia. And this is a little different than the first call. This time, the militia is being called out no matter what. So if you've had an exemption before, or for whatever reason, you still had to report to the courthouse on March 14th, 1862. So now the Underground Railroad is going to be put into operation. This is the first big test. And so on March 13th, the day before they were to report to the courthouse, actually the night before they were to report to the courthouse, refugees started to gather at places like Peggy's Depot. She would have just been one of many in Rockingham County. And then they went from there to the Beery Depot. I was asking Peggy Schifflet earlier if that house is still there, and she said that it was. Peggy, are you in the audience, or I'm not seeing Peggy? But apparently that house is still there. It was the Sam Beery house, and this was kind of the mountain rendezvous point. It was at the base of Little North Mountain, or near the base of Little North Mountain, a little bit southwest of Singer's Glen. And in my opinion, the refugees probably went across the edge, the southern tip of Little North Mountain, rather than to cut between the ridges there, because I think the gap would have been probably pretty closely guarded. But then once they got on the other side, they could have followed Little North Mountain right up to Brock's Gap, and straight on north through Brock's Gap, through Burton, or Dovesville is what it was called at the time. Are most people familiar with the Dovesville name historically? Yes, Burton was Dovesville at the time. So on this map we see Dovesville. And then on across the Shenandoah Mountain to, Shenandoah's here, to a place called Judy's on the South Fork, the Judy Farm, and that's where they spent the night. Now, the people at the top of this photo, that's Nimrod and Mary Ann Judy, and they would have been the owners of Judy's on the South Fork at the time. The name of the town over there it's not really a town, but it's a place called Piru. Very familiar with Piru? Yes. Okay. So this is actually a quote from Peggy's War that imagines what it would have been like when they arrived. And I do not think that Nimrod and Mary Ann Judy expected 70 plus refugees to show up that night, but that's how many did show up, and we'll learn that's a big mistake to send that many people through the mountains at a time. So they did feed them, they took care of them, and they sent them on their way. And the guy on the left is George Judy. Does anyone here know George Judy? Yes. George was there to greet me. He knew I was coming. And I think just to mess with me, George is wearing his Confederate belt buckle. And I think he just wanted to see what I would say about that. And we talked about it. And I told George that, your ancestor here on the farm were actually Unionists. And that was a big surprise to him. They were actually in favor of keeping the Union together. And George would have guessed the other way. He's standing, by the way, between their two tombstones. And that's very close to their house. Now, after they leave the Judy farm, they go across the South Fork Mountain and arrive in Petersburg, probably still morning, maybe noon. And they go through the town of Petersburg, but before they do that, they have a lot of difficulty fording the stream because it's been raining quite a bit. And the actual history of this is, and this photo is not all the way back to the Civil War, but this bridge would not have been there at the time of the Civil War. This is Petersburg. This is the South Branch of the Potomac, and there was a ferry operator there. I don't know if there was always a ferry operator there or only when the water level was high. And they chose, for some reason, not to use the ferry and to try to cross the river on their own. And this took a long time and drew a lot of attention to this very large group of refugees. And then they went on through Petersburg, north, straight through the town. And they thought they were safe. They thought they were doing pretty well. And then they were captured by two parolees that had been in custody by the Union Army. They were Confederate irregulars. They were Confederate Home Guard soldiers who had actually promised not to oppose the Union anymore in exchange for their release. That's why we call them parolees. So these two parolees capture this group of 70 plus men because, again, they're non-resistant. They're not going to fight against anyone, and they are captured and brought back to the town of Petersburg. And then in the town, the story goes that they were asked to give up their weapons. And they did actually have one small pistol with them. There was a pocket pistol, but other than that, they would hand over these New Testaments, these little mini New Testaments, and say, these are our swords of the Spirit. We don't have any guns. Now, that day, they were taken from Petersburg south after they were captured. And they have more guards now. It's not just two guys. It's maybe six to eight guards, taking them south to Captain Bond's house here. And that is roughly where 220 crosses Brushy Run in West Virginia. It's the confluence of Brushy Run and North Mill Creek. There is no house there that goes back to the Civil War, but that was their next stop. And at that stop, Peter Blosser, one of the Mennonite refugees, actually escapes the next morning and goes back to tell everyone what has happened in the valley. So Peter Blosser, I think, was probably told to do that as part of a plan. I don't think he just lost his nerve or anything like that. And we do know that he had a horse. A lot of these men, most of these men, did not have horses, so they're on foot. So after that, for a while, they watched the refugees a little more closely as they come south to Franklin. And then at Franklin, they were interrogated and bothered a little bit, but not harmed physically. And then after a night in Franklin, they went south to Monterey. And this would have been a really long leg, 24 miles south. And they spent the night on the floor, sleeping on the floor in the Monterey Courthouse, which we do have a picture, postcard illustration of the Monterey, this would be the Highland County Courthouse, before it burned. So not as far back as the Civil War, but certainly maybe early 20th century illustration here of what it looks like. Now, when it burned, they rebuilt the courthouse, and the one that's there today looks a lot like this. So they actually tried to replicate it. So after Monterey, the group probably at that point was taken over by the Churchville Cavalry, which is a home guard unit of Confederate soldiers that would have been near Stanton. And they would have been brought down to an empty house here, somewhere between the top of the Shenandoah and Stanton, probably still in the mountains, we know that. It was an abandoned house, and at the abandoned house, this very strange thing happens. I guess they had started to gain the trust of their captors, and the captors say, this house is not really big enough for all of us tonight, so we'll go stay at a house nearby, about half a mile away, if you'll promise not to run, if you'll promise not to escape. And they did. They said, okay, we promise. And the soldiers left, and it wasn't too long before the refugees started talking about running. And one of the Dunker men that was in the group, we know from firsthand accounts, didn't like that because they had promised not to, and they were bound to keep their word. So he actually tattletaled a little bit, and someone went and got the guards, brought them back, and they were not allowed to escape. One refugee did escape at that point, or soon thereafter. So now they come down to Stanton, and we know that the Churchville Cavalry brought them into Stanton, and they guarded them fairly closely. They took it seriously, and they overheard this comment, and this is from a first-hand account. Don't tell them that they have to go to Richmond tomorrow. They will not sleep well. And in fact, many of the refugees, especially the deserters, we had draft dodgers and we had deserters. Draft dodging is not a super serious offense at that point, but desertion is starting to become more of an offense that might be punishable by execution. And so some of them thought, maybe we will be executed when we get to Richmond. And they packed them onto boxcars similar to this one, and they typically did not take time to clean the boxcars out between cattle and prisoners, or cattle and soldiers. It was very dirty, very smelly kind of environment. And then they continue on from Stanton, and of course come to Rockfish Gap. And this is a nice example here, I think, of how I did the story, the book. If you read this, many of the boxcar brethren expected to die in Richmond, true. As the train began chugging up Afton Mountain, the boxcar rocked from side to side, certainly true. Brunk's stomach, Brunk is one of the refugees, was on the brink of rebellion. Okay, imagination there. That's not something we know from any first-hand account, but if it had been me, my stomach would have been beyond the brink of rebellion. And then the train levels out, which the tracks do, for a few seconds before plunging into total darkness, because they're going into the Blue Ridge Tunnel. Now, think about if you're one of the refugees and you grew up in Rockingham County or especially Western Rockingham County, and you've never seen a train before. The train didn't come to Harrisonburg. It came as far as Mount Jackson, and it came as far as Stanton. But in between, there was no train service. So many of these young men had never even seen a train. So they would have been interested in the train, but they would have been terrified when that train suddenly goes into a tunnel that they probably weren't aware of at the top of Afton Mountain. How many here have actually walked through the Blue Ridge Tunnel? It's also called the Crozet Tunnel. It's a great thing to do if you can walk a mile to get to the tunnel entrance. I highly recommend it. Now I want to talk about a second group. The first group goes on to Richmond and has many other adventures in Richmond. Well, I won't tell you what happens in Richmond. It's always tempting. But I'm going to move on to group 2. This is a second group of refugees who probably left on that same night, the night of March 13th. And they would have left from the Jacob Miller house, which was a depot on the Underground Railroad. And we have a first-hand account there from John M. Klein. This is not Elder Klein, this is a different John Klein, who said and tells us in the book called The Olive Branch, that they started from Brother Jacob Miller's house. Jacob Miller was an elder in the Brethren Church and had a busy depot on the Underground Railroad. So we're starting here at the bottom, at the Miller Depot, and I am supposing that they went next to the Swank Mountain Depot because it was the closest one. And I think in keeping with our Head for the Hills theme, I think they sought the safety of cover and like to get to the mountain depots quickly. Now, once they were there, they could have gone around the edge of Little North Mountain like the first group did, but I don't think they did. I think they would have gone straight north on the back road and then turned left, and there is at the time, there was a bridle path across Little North Mountain that came out to the Michael Wine Depot. Does anyone know about that bridle path? Is it still there? Anyone that knows something about it? Because I'd love to know more about it. I mentioned it to Peggy Shiflett earlier this morning, and she said that her father brought her mother across that bridle path when she was having, I believe she said, her 18th child. And they took a shortcut and just came the other direction across the bridle path to come here, I guess, to a midwife to have the baby. So anyhow, our group of refugees then would have gone north through Brock's Gap area, and then north by northwest up through Dovesville, not quite there yet, past Third Mountain and on up. And then we're going to have to move to a bigger map to follow them. They made it, they probably went to Judy's on the South Fork. We don't know that for sure, but it would have been a logical progression. And then they made it almost to Moorefield. And this is a picture of Moorefield here. Again, not all the way back to the Civil War, but probably turn of the century kind of photograph of what Moorefield looked like. And before they got there, though, they came to this camp of Confederate pickets, soldiers, that were guarding that territory. And they tried to play it cool. You know, they just rode on as though they had nothing to worry about. But the Confederate soldiers did chase them, and there was a little bit of a chase scene. Some of the men on all of these men were on horseback. So we had at that point we had 20, we think, men on horseback, no walkers, and they were trying to outrun their pursuers. So they weren't quite as non-resistant as the first group. These are mostly brethren, and two of the horsemen were not able to go fast enough to escape, and they asked the others to hold back. And most of them did, but one or two did continue on and make their escape. But then this group was captured just shy of Moorefield. And they were brought the very next day, and this is also a very long trip, the very next day to Woodstock, where they were held for one day. I should mention the timing of this from the Miller Depot at Greenmount all the way to Moorefield. This is less than 24 hours. So they were able to move faster than the first group because they all had horses, but still, I believe this is about 45 miles through there, close to 45 miles on horseback. So the horses would have been exhausted as well. And then they did use the same horses to come down to Woodstock. And then at Woodstock, they took their horses. They also took some money from them. They had gold and silver, several $1,000s among them. And I don't think any of that money ever was given back. But they also lost their horses at that point. And then after one night, possibly two nights at Woodstock, they go south on the Valley Pike to Mount Jackson. I couldn't find a really great old photo of Mount Jackson, so I just did a shot of the Valley Pike at the turn of the century. And it's similar to what it would have looked back then, a macadamized road, very straight, fairly wide for roads of that time. So they would have had an easy time walking now to Mount Jackson. And then on the following day, they walked a lot farther to Bethlehem Church. Does anyone know where Bethlehem Church is? A few. You can go there. It is still standing, and that is I believe, the original structure. They went up the pike. There may even be a plaque there, I think, that talks about this. And they spent the night at Bethlehem Church. That was not unusual for prisoners of war and soldiers to kind of commandeer that particular church. And then the next day, all the way to Harrisonburg. And of course, they were held at the courthouse here in Harrisonburg for about 2 weeks. And I'll leave that group there because a lot of very interesting things do happen in Harrisonburg, but I want to have time to do one more group. I should mention, before we move on to the third group, and the third group is going to be brief, from Harrisonburg, they do eventually get released, I'll tell you that much. And Elder John Klein from Broadway was held with them at the Harrisonburg courthouse. And I think it's very interesting that if you look at Klein's diary, where did he go the first night after he left the courthouse? He goes back to the Miller Depot. So my headline up here says, back to the Miller Depot, but I think you could also call it back to the drawing board, because I think John Klein and Peggy's uncle, Doc Heatwole, were the brains behind the Underground Railroad. And certainly John Klein at that point would have wanted to regroup with some of the other leaders and say, okay, this didn't work. Can we fix it or not? And they do fix it. The Underground Railroad is in operation throughout the war and conveys thousands of refugees, not all of them Mennonites and Dunkers. By the end of the war, it was mostly other people who were just done fighting. So now I do want to move on briefly to group 3. And again, this is all happening at the same time. So this group starts out with Samuel Rhodes down at Byerly's Mill, which is it's in Pleasant Valley, south of Harrisonburg. And he and his brother, probably, go north by northeast to Wisson's Mill, where they're supposed to connect with about 50 other refugees who are part of group 1 that goes to the Beery Depot right after that. But they get there late and they miss the other refugees. So this is a problem because they don't have a guide and they don't have horses either. So this group is about 12 people at this point. They decide to spend one more night at Wisson's Mill, and then they regroup the next morning and decided, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to go try to get to New Creek Station and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad all by ourselves, no guide, no horses. And they did okay at first. They went north by northeast, probably right past Raleigh Springs. And they get on Dry River Road and wrap around somewhere in here behind Feedstone Mountain. And they found a safe house there that was run by a man named May, we think, either Henry or John Henry May. And I think that was the goal. Get to the safe house and then ask directions, right? So they ask directions, and he tells them, there's a trail that goes from here up to the top of the Shenandoah Mountain. And that was really good advice. There is a good trail there. I think it's now the top portion of Long Run Road is what it is, or very close to that alignment. So they go to the top of the mountain, Shenandoah Mountain, and it's raining, it's very, very foggy, and they take a wrong turn. They get confused, and if you look at a modern map of how those trails converge right at that spot, it's a little confusing. So if you can imagine that you're scared, it's raining, it's foggy, they get turned around, and they think they're walking northwest into West Virginia, heading toward Petersburg, and in fact they're going almost straight east towards Brock's Gap. And then what I think happened is, we do know that this is in the middle of the night. And I think what happened is, as the sun starts to show a little bit in the east or southeast, I think they noticed that the sky's getting lighter in the wrong place. So all of a sudden they, I think, realized we might be walking east instead of west. And again, they stop and ask directions in the middle of the night. And the person we don't know which refugee asked directions, but in my book I have it be Samuel Rhodes' brother, Henry L. Rhodes. And Henry gets some directions, and they not only tell them they're walking the wrong way, but they tell them that group ahead of you that you're trying to catch up with has been captured in Petersburg, and you might want to rethink what you're doing here. So they decide, after a big argument, they decide we're going to go straight back the way they came, and they retrace all of this all the way back home. And presumably they went their separate ways after they come through Raleigh Springs here. But they did reconvene later and try again and actually go back to a hiding place in southwest of Raleigh Springs in a later chapter of the book. But I like this example because it shows that they were willing to try even though they didn't have a guide, they didn't have horses, and it was just a colossal failure. It was not a good thing. So all three groups failed, and we don't know if there was a fourth and a fifth group that night. I think someone would have made note of it along the way if there had been, but we do know about these three groups. So that's the official part of my presentation. I'm always happy to take questions, and I know I've given you a lot of information, so I do expect a few questions of things that probably left out or forgot to mention. So.
Did anybody make it?
Oh, thank you. And we did have a question.
Did anybody make it?
Did anybody make it? In the short run on that night, no. Well, the two refugees that went on ahead at Moorefield may have made it. They may have known where they're going. They were getting close. They were more than halfway to New Creek Station and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was what they were trying to do. So those two guys may have made it on that night. None of the rest of them made it on that night, but there was then an exemption for religious reasons to keep some of the men out of the war if they were already members of the Mennonite or Brethren or other peace church. And then, of course, that exemption expired and it was back and forth. So ultimately, almost all of them did make it. But that night, maybe one, maybe two. That's it. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make a comment. I'm from Michigan, and
Yes.
when I come down here for the last 10 years, my mind gets all mushy because I have a Union perspective. I studied Civil War with a Union perspective. I come down here and then I can't sort out the general. Your book gave me a structure that I definitely now understand a whole lot more of the valley and the burning, which was mentioned as well, than I ever had before.
Thank you. I'll repeat some of that. Mrs. Good said that she's from Michigan, and this book gives her a better perspective than many of the other books she's tried to read, that not just the Mennonite perspective or the Dunker perspective, but the actual who were the generals in charge at the time and what were the troop movements and that sort of thing. And I did spend a lot of time researching all of that so that you see what context the Mennonite and Dunker refugees, what type of context are they operating in. And I should also mention along those lines that this is barely mentioned in the book, but there was a secular rebellion going on the east side of Rockingham County called the Rockingham Rebellion. Has anyone heard of the Rockingham Rebellion? So Stonewall Jackson, from his perspective, he has Mennonites and Dunkers who are refusing to fight, and they're trying to leave the valley, and he's trying to deal with that. He also has militiamen who have completed 1 year of service, who volunteered early, and that's all they were really required to do. And several, maybe hundreds of those refused to continue to fight. So there was a skirmish over near Swift Run Gap. So all of this is happening in the same 2 weeks, really, 2 or 3 weeks. Yes.
implication to the Judy family for cooperating with the group?
Good question. The question, the way I understand it, is was there any retribution toward the Judy family because they had assisted refugees? I'm not aware of any in the Judy family. I don't think they were ever caught. I think they managed somehow to have large numbers of refugees pass through that farm without getting caught. The house itself is a good ways from the road there, and it's a good ways from the South Fork of the South Branch of the Potomac. So passersby might not have known what was going on the Judy farm. But I do think they were probably the most important depot because the Judy family was very, very tight with Elder Klein, and they went back generations with Elder Klein. So I do think they were a very important depot, and they, as far as I know, were never caught. There were a few others that were tried. Generally were not convicted because the logic was, would you provide this assistance to other people, not just Mennonites and Dunkers? And the answer was always yes, we would. So if someone needs help, we'll provide it. And I guess these were argued in front of juries, and juries went, okay, that makes sense. So a lot of people were actually tried and acquitted, but most of those people then went west pretty quickly after that because there were threats against them outside the legal system. More questions? Yes, sir. Mr. Good?
Just a personal footnote. My great-grandfather, Daniel Good, was a member of that first group, the 72, and I just wondered if you wanted to speak for a minute more on what happened to that group as they were herded toward Richmond and Castle Thunder.
Daniel J. Good? Daniel J.
Henry Good.
I'm sorry, what?
Daniel Henry.
Daniel H. Good. Daniel H. Good was among the 70-plus refugees, and I'm working on a list of all of those. I'm up to about 70, but I know it's probably closer to 76 or 78. So Daniel H. Good was, I'm guessing he was one of the ones who was probably too young to be a member of a church yet? Or did the exemption apply to him?
The exemption applied to him.
Okay, so once they arrived in Richmond, and again, I'm probably giving away too much, but once they arrived in Richmond, there was a very sympathetic ear there. Sidney Baxter was the habeas corpus commissioner for the War Department, and he made a recommendation that if you were already a member of the Peace Church at the beginning of the war, that you should be given an exemption, you pay a fine, and there's a property tax on top of that fine, and then you go home. And it took a legislature, the Virginia legislature had to pass a law to that effect, but they did so very quickly. And so the young men, like your ancestor, who were already members of the church, were allowed to go home at that point. Of course, a few days later, there was a Confederate conscription act that was passed that seemed to supersede the Virginia conscription act and made no mention of exemptions. So you had kind of a states' rights conflict there going on within the Confederacy. That was interesting. But your ancestor was allowed to go home. More questions?
It seemed like a mistake that they burned the farm barns in some of the residents that was owned by the Union sympathizers. It seemed like that was a mistake.
Yes. The problem was during the burning, of course, Lieutenant Meigs, John Meigs, was murdered, and that accelerated and exacerbated the burning around Peggy's farm. She was about 2 miles from where Meigs was killed. And the order went out from Sheridan to burn everything. I believe the order was within 5 miles. Other reports say 3 miles, but I think it's really 5 miles. But if you look at a map, that would have included Harrisonburg. So the town of Dayton was spared, but there was a lot of burning in a heavily unionist area. So it's very ironic. And it was a mistake, but it was made out of anger and vengeance. And Sheridan was convinced that his Lieutenant Meigs, had been murdered as opposed to a casualty of war. I don't think he was murdered. I think it was he was a casualty of war. But yes, it was a mistake. Yes, ma'am.
2 questions.
Two questions.
The Judy Depot still intact? Is it a farm?
Yes, it is a farm. George Judy does not like visitors because of bringing, would it be bacteria or viruses onto the property for his poultry? But there is a house there that goes back to the 19th century. It's not the original house that was there at the time of Peggy's War, but it was built on the original foundation. And it's a fairly large house for its location. And this is a very large farm for that area. And it goes back to the Revolutionary War. It was in the Rohrball family before the Judy family. And so yeah, he and his, it's primarily George, but also one of the brothers is active in running that farm. And it's a large farming operation there.
Will you be producing a second edition?
The question is, will there be a second edition? I think there will be, but I don't know that it'll be a popular, commercially viable book. I do want to write the story of Peggy's son, who's my great-grandfather, who would have been right in the middle when the Mennonite church split into the Old Orders and the Virginia Middle District Mennonites. That split occurred right down the middle of Peggy's family. Peggy was already dead when that happened, but her children went, half of the family went one way and half of the family went the other way. So I don't know if it would be quite as exciting as the Civil War, but I think it's an interesting story. Any other questions? Yes?
I wondered if you might give a little plug to that remarkable unionist book that Norman Wanger and David Rhodes collaborated on.
Yes, I should have done a better job of that at the time, but yes, there's a 6-volume set called Unionists and the Civil War Experience in the Shenandoah Valley. It was compiled by Norman Wanger, who's sitting halfway back on the right side here, and David Rhodes, who's a very distant cousin of mine, and Emmert Bettinger. Did I say that right? And it is brilliantly done. It is all of the testimony that really brought us this type of story. If it hadn't been for that, I don't think you would see books like this. It just wouldn't be possible because they did all the research and the hard work. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience.